Hello, Yosef.
Am I
Hello.
in the right? Hi, am I in the right place?
Yes, you are definitely. I just want to
Okay.
let you know that people are going to be coming in now, but your audio and your video look good. So if you want to hide your video and mute yourself, you can do that. And then we'll get started around 3.
Okay. Where are we? All right. Are we doing it? Are we checking in behind the scenes first? No? Well, we're good?
You look good. So my check-in is all done. But if you want to use the chat for any questions to the other panelists, please feel free to do that. Or if you have any questions for Ishel, Ishel is here. Hello. And
I see you, Michelle. Hi. Thank you.
Caroline, can you see me?
yes, I can see you and hear you very clearly.
Okay, great. And so when I make my closing remarks, the audience will be able to see me.
Yes, yep. And I don't know how many participants are in right now. I think we only have one person, and it might be Lauren in the room right now. So yes,
Okay.
you are visible and we can hear you right now.
Great. Okay, I'll go back behind the scenes. Thanks.
Yep, no problem. Thanks.
I guess I'll follow suit and do this.
Sounds good. Thanks. Hello, Bernard. How are you today? I think your audio is still connecting. We'll wait for that to go up. Hello, can you hear me? Hi, Bernard. This is Caroline from University Life. I can't hear you right now. Can you test your audio?
Hi, Caroline. How are you doing?
Great. That sounds great. Is there any way that you can push your webcam down a little bit more so we could see more of your face or angle it a little bit?
Sure. Let me just, yeah. It says we're live on YouTube.
Yes, we're live right now. It's a link that we're just going to put up on our website, so it's not a public link. But we are live right now. We have people coming into the room so they can see and hear you right now. But I'm just testing your audio and your video. And your audio sounds good, so we'll just get your video in place. Wonderful. That looks great. Do you have any questions before 3?
No, I think I'm all set. Thanks.
Okay, great. So you can feel free to mute and turn off your video until we get started.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you.
Take care.
Hello, Carmela. This is Caroline from University Life. I hope you're well. How are you doing today?
I'm okay. How are you, Caroline?
I'm great. Can we just test your video really quickly? I know we're live and some people are filtering in, but I just want to make sure that all looks good and then you can go back. That
Yeah.
looks great. Your audio sounds good. Do you have any questions before we start?
No, not at all.
Okay, great. So yeah, feel free to mute and block your video and we'll start around 3.
Okay, sounds. Oh, actually, Caroline, I do have a question. For the debrief, are you hoping we stay around for the debrief as well?
That's a separate link, and it should be in your calendar. But if not, I can forward you that email, and it's just a separate meeting link.
Oh, okay, okay. But you're hoping that we can join for the debrief as well?
Yes, if you have availability, that would be great.
Yeah, I probably can for about 10 minutes. I have an like an administrative meeting that I have to attend, but I'll join for some of it.
Okay, no problem. That sounds good.
That's good.
Great, thanks. And hi, Dennis. How are you doing today? This is Caroline from University Life.
Hi, Carolyn. How are you doing?
I'm great. So it looks like your video and audio were great. If you need to talk at any point during this meeting, feel free. But if not, you can definitely mute yourself, block your video, and we're going to start around 3.
Okay, and just so that I'm clear, you're going to keep this this up all the way, and then when you remove it, I should start.
Yes, exactly. Right.
Okay, you'll give the audience a couple of minutes, I assume.
Yes, yeah, and they should be coming in. We have about 5 people in attendance right now, but they should be coming in closer to 3.
Okay, and once I turn it over to Joseph, I think I will probably mute and stop video share. Will I be off screen after that?
Correct. Yes. If you're
Good.
muted and you don't have your video on, then you will be like a ghost.
Great, great. That's a good way to be today.
Yes.
Good luck to everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Dennis.
How are you feeling, Joseph? You ready?
I'm doing all right. I'm here in good company, so I'm good.
Absolutely. Great. Do we have everybody aboard?
I think we're waiting for Dr. Griffin right now,
Okay,
but almost.
great. That's good.
Caroline, can you make Adina a panelist?
Oh, yes, sure. Yes.
Thank you.
Yep, no problem. Dennis, you can also feel free to turn off your video until 3 if you'd like. Hello, Dr. Griffin. This is Caroline Hirsch from University Life. How are you doing today? You're on mute, sorry.
Okay. I'm fine, thank you.
Great, great. So it looks like your audio and video are good. We are live and we do have some attendees in the room right now.
Okay.
But it looks like it's all set. Do you have any questions before we start?
No, not at all.
Okay, wonderful. So feel free to mute and turn off your video until we start, and we should begin around 3.
Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you to this afternoon's University Life Forum entitled Racial Justice, the Chauvin Trial, and Beyond. I'm Dennis Mitchell, Vice Provost for Faculty Advancement here at Columbia University. And I must begin today by reminding us all, most importantly, to say his name, George Floyd, the father, the son, the brother, and the grandfather, who was murdered by Derek Chauvin while his colleagues looked on. Sadly, we have seen this before. This is not the first time a police officer has murdered an unarmed Black American. We have seen the grim footage, 9 minutes and 29 seconds of it captured entirely by a 17-year-old who happened to be there, who knew that it was their duty to document this, because the account of a white police officer in cases like this is seldom questioned, because the very institution of policing in the United States has its origins in slave patrols, in enforcement of Black codes, and in Jim Crow era lynchings. We cannot overlook the political backdrop of America in May of last year, or for the last 4 years prior to that, where we had a president who built his political platform on delegitimizing the first Black American president, dehumanizing Black and brown Americans, who himself weaponized the US Park Police and National Guard troops to tear gas a crowd of protesters, who used the words like thugs to describe activists in the Black Lives Matter movement, who exalted a white teenager wielding an AR-15, who was thanked by police and given a bottle of water before killing 2 protesters. A president who praised the white couple standing, guns at the ready, as peaceful protesters walked by in an effort to protect their possessions. This president galvanized an ugly, racist part of America in his effort to reclaim their country, to make America great again. Unfortunately, this is as old as our nation. We also cannot overlook the pandemic and its disproportionate impact on communities of color. We had experienced over 100,000 American deaths at that moment. Now it's well over 500,000, as well as the ripple effect of the devastation to their loved ones. In 2020, we were already all numb before this tragedy, because to feel all of this pain would completely immobilize us. When the footage of Derek Chauvin's knee on the neck of George Floyd aired again and again and again, there was a captive audience of onlookers around the world, stuck home and glued to our televisions and our computer screens in horror. Is this what it takes to get people to acknowledge our humanity? That Black lives do matter? The movement's allies, those who have been doing racial justice work for years, watched on, weary, as we witnessed the performative outrage. Protest selfies, corporations standing in solidarity. Then the spotlight fades, and our Twitter feeds forget, and we move on to the nation's next shiny object that distracts us. The actions of Derek Chauvin on May 25th, 2020, have set in motion a worldwide call. There were protests on every continent, and Colombia was also listening. Our imperfect institution, built by slaves and originally run by slave owners, whose names have been displayed prominently in our buildings, has its own work to do. When those in our community feel erased and unheard, we must first acknowledge their truth and witness their pain before pointing toward policies and procedures that offer little solace. I can say that we are committed to doing the hard work, and we are heartened that the university leadership is with us. And though we have much ground to cover, we remain hopeful as we await the verdict. We have faculty panelists in a broad cross-section of disciplines with us to offer their perspectives on the trial and its implications for the future. I am pleased to welcome this afternoon my colleague, Carmela Alcantara, Associate Professor, Associate Dean for Doctoral Education, Columbia University School of Social Work. Farah Jasmine Griffin, Chair, Department of African American and African Diasporic Studies, the William B. Ransford Professor of English and Comparative Literature and African American and American Studies, and Professor of African American and African Diasporic Studies. Bernard Harcourt, the Isidore and Seville Solbacher Professor of Law and Professor of Political Science at Columbia University. And our moderator this afternoon, Yosef Surret, Professor and Chair, Department of Religion, Professor, Department of African American and African Diasporic Studies. It is my pleasure to turn it this afternoon over to you, Yosef.
Thank you, Dennis. Good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for joining us, Dennis. Thank you for setting the mood so powerfully and for creating the space for this conversation, both to your office and the Office of University Life. And thank you to my panelists this day, who I feel the privilege and opportunity to learn from this afternoon. I think, Dennis, you have already, in such a clear and powerful way, clarified the context and as well as the stakes of this conversation, that what we are thinking about is, of course, centered around a trial in a particular place at this moment in time, but we're also thinking about so much more. We're thinking about questions and problems that are far-reaching around the world and that also hit us closest to home, even in the context of the institution of Columbia University. And I very much appreciate the reminder that we are, of course, first and foremost, thinking about lives lost and lives taken. George Floyd, Dante Wright, but a longer list, even just over the past year, that is too long to enumerate. I want to recognize the complexity of questions that all of the panelists might help us think through, as well as that might come with our audience to this conversation. That when we ask questions of this trial, of its proceedings, of whatever verdicts might be rendered, that we are, of course, thinking about the courts and the law more broadly. We are thinking about policing and the criminal justice system, and a longer histories of trials that resemble the one before us. And we are, of course, thinking about a wider history of race and racism and white supremacy, and of the conditions of Black life that emerge in response to and in the context of these questions. And then we are also thinking about American democracy and what all of this might mean for the future of this nation and the world. As I said already, I feel so fortunate that we have such incredible colleagues on the panel here to help us lead in this conversation, who bring a range of expertises that help to open up our conversation in new ways and to get at, and if not answer, help us refine the questions that we bring to the table today. I want to begin by just opening up a general question to each of them and invite them to respond in however they see fit from their own experiences and expertise. And then we might have a follow-up round that gestures in the direction of their more specific expertise. And then we'll see where we go from there. I know we're also, in light of questions that have been submitted in advance and that may also come by way of the chat, eager to engage in Q&A as the program proceeds. So the first question that I would just ask, and we'll move in alphabetical order to begin. So Carmela, I'd ask you to be the first, and then Professor Griffin, and then Professor Harcourt. The first question is just simply, what does this trial mean to you, or what do you think it means for us in light of your own experience? Why is it so important beyond just the courtroom in which it's being held? And please, I'll just stop there and open it up.
Yeah, thank you, Yosef, for the opportunity to participate on this panel. And also, you know, I can imagine the great effort it took the university to put this together during such constraints on time. And again, I'm here to offer sort of my perspective, and I think to clarify questions. I think most of us are ourselves particularly, I think, those who identify as Black or Indigenous and people of color really trying to both cope with the trial, process the trial, and then look ahead and beyond towards broader implications. I see it, and I think, Dr. Mitchell did such a great job and provided such a powerful statement that historicizes what this trial means and the events and histories that have led to where we are today. But as I see it, it feels like a moment of reckoning, a moment with anti-Black racism, with the killing of George Floyd, with, killing of countless other Black bodies, Breonna Taylor. So it's about George Floyd, and yet it's about so much more. And a moment also of accountability, sort of public accountability and responsibility in ways that we haven't seen before, or that, typically most of these cases will be have not proceeded to a court trial. So it's, I think, historic for that moment. You asked a couple of critical points. I know in relation to how I'm experiencing this moment as, Black identified Latina and psychologist, it's this interesting, I find myself thinking a lot about public health and also mental health. And I think we'll probably touch upon that later, but it's this interesting process of how, do you cope with the 3 weeks of trial proceedings and testimony that have happened, and obviously deep interest and care with what happens with the outcome of this trial, and also the implications of it, while at the same time managing self-care. I mean, so many of the conversations I've had with colleagues and students has been around this sense of exhaustion that is only compounded by, recent events like Dante Wright's killing and now Adam Toledo. So it's been, again, I think it's been a strategic or careful balance between engaging really deeply with the proceedings and the testimonies, and at the same time balancing and understanding the importance of radical self-care in these very acute moments. I'll sort of stop there because I think we'll have an opportunity to elaborate more.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Professor Alcantara. Professor Griffin.
Thank you, Yosef, and I echo what my colleagues have said. This feels like a moment with both a deep familiarity, but also something different. I have, what happened with Derek Chauvin and George Floyd is not new. It has happened my entire life. Very rarely has it ended up in a trial of a police officer, very rarely. And almost always those officers are let off when it happens. So I think what I bring to it is that sense of deep history, both as a scholar and personally, and both a sort of war within myself to not have expectations, not have the expectation of justice, and yet sitting on the edge of my seat with a sense of hopefulness every single time, hopefulness, and always looking at what might be different this time. But I think, it used to be, well, surely everyone saw. That used to be the difference. Everyone saw. And since Rodney King, I've let that go because we don't see the same things. And so always looking for what might be different that might lead us in the way of justice. And in this time, certainly the uprising, the people in the streets, the global attention, where for the first time it didn't feel like people of African descent were so alone in this. And I think with this trial, even though, the whole question of self-care with this trial, as I would say, I can't watch it, but I had to watch it. And seeing something different in the trial. And that's the sort of police officers and the representatives of the state saying this was wrong. And so that lending a sense of hopefulness that maybe there will be a fairness here, and yet, wanting to maintain my skepticism, my sense of reality, as if, so that I can say that no matter what happens, I won't be disappointed, knowing that that's not true. So that's what I think. That's what I feel. A kind of both and set of experiences.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Farah. Bernard.
Thank you. And I'm thanks for hosting this and moderating this. And I'm so warmed to be with you all, and Farah, Carmela, Joseph, Yosef. And I hope that we can go with first names rather than professors. So I've tried to watch this through different lenses, and one of the most powerful ones was actually a video on the New York Times that they put up yesterday, I think, which was watching the trial through the eyes with the families of other police shootings and beatings, and for those who haven't watched it, I think it's a really important. It's a really important experience. It's actually a video that watches the trial through the eyes of the daughter of Rodney King, as you were talking about Rodney King's beating, Farah, and through the eyes of the mother of Oscar Grant, who, as you remember, was killed at Fruitvale Station, and the mother and grandmother of Stephon Clark, who were killed in 2018, and in watching the trial in their living rooms with their families, and the trauma and the difficulty of that is simply harrowing. And I think in part it is through those eyes that I have also tried to experience personally the trial itself. But all of these interventions that you've been making about a reckoning and accountability, Carmela, as you were talking about, and the trauma, and also Farah about the deep familiarity and the rareness of this actually taking place, I think I agree with fully. But I also experience it with a deep sense of frustration, and it's that frustration, I think, that is lingering, that I'm unable to get rid of. It's this, in part, it's this frustration. I view this personally as someone who's been a death penalty lawyer representing folks on death row for decades now, and the representation of this trial is so off of what the criminal legal ordeal is really like in this country. The way in which this is the process that Chauvin is receiving is so radically different than the kind of trials that I deal with, where my clients are sentenced to death within 2 days. I mean, from jury selection to death penalty hearings that last 19 minutes with just one mother giving monosyllabic, unprepared responses, and a death sentence that results the next day. To watch this and to think that Americans are getting the impression that this is what the criminal justice system is like is for me so painful and frustrating. When in fact, what we're talking about are rooms filled with African-American young men who are chained together in jumpsuits and mostly taking pleas en masse, right? 99% of American criminal legal process is this plea enforcement against young African-American, Latinx young men, right? And it's just this image that we're giving ourselves as if this was the criminal justice or, criminal legal, or I call it a criminal legal ordeal. We used to call it the criminal legal system, but whatever you want to call it, this is not what we are dealing with today. And that is a sense of frustration that I have, that I just don't know what to do with, in part because even though this trial is so important in terms of accountability and responsibility, it's a distraction from the larger movement for Black lives, I feel, in many ways. And that's something that I hope we'll get to talk about during this time together.
Absolutely. Thank you, Bernard. Thank you so much for that. I guess I want to come right back to you to ask a follow-up question. I appreciate the sort of reframing of the courtroom in that regard, right? That what we're seeing is not typical order, right? This is in fact an inversion of the kind of injustice that is very much embedded and structured in the criminal justice system. So I very much appreciate that reframing. I guess I also want to ask a question and ask maybe if there were some guidance you might give us and the viewers, right? I think about the various kinds of expertise I might bring to viewing the film. It's not legal expertise, right? And the sort of expectations we might have of a verdict either way. I wonder, like, what from a legal framework, what sort of things should we be thinking about as we're all waiting for a verdict that we're hopeful, but also have a certain kind of reasoned expectation wherever we lay on these things. So I wonder if there might be some sort of legal guidance that you might be able to give to those who've tuned in, both around thinking about charges and the verdicts and the implications within the context of the courts.
Well, sure, I can play the, lawyer for a moment, although I hope that we'll get past that quickly, because I think the issues here are larger than legal in a sense. But there are 3 counts here, which effectively are different ways of characterizing the homicide. And it's actually presented in an odd way to the public that there are 3 counts, because in fact what there are 3 different ways of understanding what the homicide was, and they're different. In other words, so it's and they're lesser included in a sense. I mean, there's 2nd-degree murder, 3rd-degree murder, and 2nd-degree manslaughter. And the first one, which is the most severe, 2nd-degree murder, is actually what's called felony murder. So it's murder during the course of a felony, where the felony here is assault. That's the maximum charge. It could carry a 40-year maximum, although here it would probably carry a 12-year sentence. But it's also a charge that really doesn't fit very well, because there's this kind of if he was committing an assault, he was committing a homicide. I mean, there's this bootstrapping and the prosecution wasn't very happy with it. So they were pleased when a higher court allowed them to introduce the 2nd charge, which is 3rd-degree murder. And that is basically kind of someone who evinces a depraved mind. So it's the mens rea, the mental state there, is one of kind of depravity, extreme dangerousness, acting extremely dangerous with a depraved mind. And that's what's called murder, 3rd degree. And then the 3rd charge is a manslaughter charge, which is basically a form of recklessness. And so the difference really has to do with the mental state of the defendant. But what's odd in the way it's being presented is that these are presented as if he should be guilty of all 3, when really they are lesser included offenses, which means that there's one is more grave than the other. And if you were convicted of one, you would naturally, of course, have been reckless. If you have a depraved mind, of course you're reckless. But in any event, those are the verdicts, and those are the possible verdicts, and from a kind of strictly legal perspective.
And I appreciate your patience in answering the question. I too want to get to some of the to the larger questions and sort of what this means for us all. And I'll pivot here to you, Carmela, to ask a question that sort of invites drawing on your own expertise and thinking about race and difference in mental health or what have you, right? I'm not one who likes to watch these trials as a practice of self-care, but someone else pointed out to me, well, you're moderating this panel, maybe you should watch something, right? And immediately I found myself holding my chest, not even 3 minutes in, as I'm being subjected to every angle of police camera, right? Body cameras, right? Which is part of a conversation on police reform. But I wonder, sort of, I think also of the context of so many of the conversations that come up in our classroom, and our students are struggling with this. They're watching this while they're now moving through finals, right? But so I guess I wonder, as one who works in the space of mental health, balancing the self-care with the engagement, sort of what sort of recommendations or what sort of thoughts do you have from in that vantage point, Ed? Yeah.
Yeah, Yosef, thanks for opening a space to talk about that. I think the first thing I would want to say is just to validate that what you're feeling has been, found and documented and across many different kinds of studies, that vicarious exposure to trauma, to racism, and particularly for BIPOC folks, has a real acute physiological effect that then later impacts your mental health, your physical health. So it's real. I think acknowledging that, acknowledging and validating that even the experience of watching the video and watching the trial does have an impact on your mental health and on your physical health, I think is an important point, and not a minor point. I think it's a really major point. And so I do have some thoughts about ways to minimize that, but on this point, I also want to say that it's not, this Chauvin trial and the larger racial justice uprisings related to George Floyd's killing and the other killings that we have referred to here of Black people is serving as a backdrop for some change that's happening at a broad level. And so I just want to call our attention that just last week, the Centers for Disease Control declared racism a threat to public health. I mean, that's huge. I mean, for those of us who do health disparities research, where for decades, the impact of racism in particular has been shown in terms of the impacts of racism on health, the fact that now there's national, I think, recognition of that impact is really quite remarkable, and other, dedicated efforts to think about the impact of structural racism on health and scientific processes. So it is having a larger effect. This is where the beyond piece, I think, comes into play, that it is the trial, but then there's a lot of ways in which we're contending with anti-Black racism within other institutions and structures. And I think that that deserves some discussion as well. I think, there's been other great research to show that there are spillover mental health effects from being exposed to community trauma, and that those effects are more pronounced for Black individuals. So that, again, sort of this witnessing and re-experiencing of George Floyd's killing and the bystander and witness testimony does have an impact on mental health. And so thinking about self-care from the perspective of minimizing those triggers, and I think a lot of us have referred to this, don't want to watch that war. Farah, you said that term, that war, and I think reflecting on that tension, I think, is really important. So I think minimizing triggers, again, really thinking about how self-care is incredibly critical during this moment. I think thinking about healing. So in the circles that I'm a part of, really, there's been a sense of how are you going to take care with my Black identified friends and colleagues about how are you going to take care of yourself? What does healing look like in this community? What is reparative in this moment? What does reparative work in this moment look like for you? And really acknowledging and validating that it is, this trial, the moment that we end, this historical period does have a physical and mental impact on us. I think that validation is and to know that there is evidence that actually backs that up is really important.
Thank you so much, Carmela. Build on that question of self-care and turning back to you, Farah. And I immediately, when I think of my own sort of practices, immediately the arts, music, right? The sort of traditions, right? That point to the fact that nothing about this current moment is novel, right? And that at the same time, that irrespective of what happens in the courtroom, what the courtroom does is not even provide us a glimpse of the set of strategies and practices within the context of Black communities that have sustained us over the long haul. And so thinking about your work, I was recalling Richard Iton's notion of a Black fantastic, sort of a recognition of the inability of the state to affirm the fullness of Black lives. And I wonder, like, sort of where within your own work on arts and activism and sort of how does that figure in this current conversation that is just so preoccupied with a courtroom?
Well, I think it figures greatly. I mean, one of the things that at first looks like an irony, but actually the relationship is, evident, is that in these moments of heightened awareness, and I would say heightened awareness, not heightened violence, because the whole history is violent, right? And what Bernard said, the everyday of those young men in those orange jumpsuits, and those of us who have been in those courtrooms as family members, as daughters, as sons, as spouses. There is an everydayness to it. So what is heightened in this moment is a heightened awareness of it. And that awareness comes from, one, the films, that young woman, Darnella Frazier, who is traumatized by this, filming it, and the witnesses. And I don't mean the trial witnesses only, but before they were witnesses on trial, they were bearing witness to George Floyd's life and murder. They were also participants in a community where they were just going about their day, doing their daily thing, and they encountered this, right? That's a reality. And I think our arts have always documented that reality, whether it's, over 100 years of novels and music and hip hop lyrics, and that they've always documented that. And in the process of documenting it and of bearing witness, they've also provided a space where a people can reckon that we are more than this abjection, right? That we are a community, we are a people with a history and a set of traditions and a set of rituals for dealing with those traditions. And so much of that art that we celebrate, that has nourished the world, is an art recognizing the violence of our deaths and the prematurity of our deaths. And so that there is a relationship. And I'll say this finally, I think that there is, in these moments of heightened awareness, these are also moments of heightened cultural production. And, more stories being told to bear witness to this, more songs being written, more ways of coming together as a community. There is a relationship between gathering for verses or gathering for D-Nice, right? That are not just about partying, but that are about healing as community and coming together in a ritual of togetherness. So it's there throughout all of this cultural history.
Absolutely, and that right in the form over the last year of the novel technologies, from Club Quarantine to the various ways in which our families have forged spaces across Zoom.
Yes.
Sort of making a way out of no way.
Right. And I think one of the things that resonated with what Carmela said is when, with these trials, as with, from the Zimmerman trial, checking in. How are you doing? Are you watching this? Maybe you shouldn't, checking on our elders who have seen this forever, right? Maybe you shouldn't watch it. I'll tell you if there's something you need to know. Who's going to be the witness, right? That will then share and communicate what they see.
Absolutely. So there's comment in the chat space that it appears that the verdict will be forthcoming any moment now, or shortly after we finish. Just want to acknowledge that, even as we continue to keep a larger set of questions at the forefront of our conversation. I guess maybe one of the set of questions that came in some of the chat, and we can think of the degree to which we've been bombarded with so many overlapping sets of issues that have all sort of been enfolded in a response to say something like it's sort of anti-racist project, right? The university has stepped us in this regard, but we can, from the disproportionate impact of COVID that's been mentioned earlier, to the racist discourse that runs through immigration legislation, to the more recent sort of conversation, both about anti-Asian racism versus anti-Black racism, I wonder, and I open this up to the panel as a whole, about sort of how, whether in the context of what we do on campus, but also in the context of our own lives and in your own work, how do we think about these things together in ways that don't reduce them, but also are also possibilities for finding space to work together, right? Yeah, just a sort of general way, how do we think about the various registers in which racist discourse has been manifest in physical violence, but also at the level of rhetoric, and where and how do we respond together? And that's to the panel as a whole to jump in any way as you see fit.
Well, I think that, one thing about this moment is that it does seem to be providing the opportunity for people across an ideological spectrum and a various kinds of to talk about, to have a conversation, even if we don't agree. What we can agree on is the moment, right? And one of the things that I found shocking, for instance, and Yosef, you would have been aware of this, was Pat Robertson.
Yes.
Right? I'm like, really? And so, and I'm like, if you're willing to speak, I'm willing to listen. I want to hear what you have to say about this. And so that I think if we could, this might be a moment where we could actually have this kind of conversation where the things that Bernard raised, like, while you're looking, since you're interested in this tribe, let's talk about what it really looks like, right? What it normally looks like. And I think that we're going up against a kind of media world, which is all about kind of grab attention, get ratings. This is exciting, this is titillating, that really doesn't allow for the kinds of necessary discussions, and that seems to substitute for those, but that the moment provides an opportunity, at least when we have each other's attention, to perhaps have the very difficult conversation across difference about one thing we can agree upon, is that this happened, that these attacks on Asian people are happening, that, and so if we can agree on that, that's a fact, not an opinion, then let's have a conversation about why, and let's have a conversation about what to do about it.
Absolutely. And of course, Professor Griffin was making mention of Pat Robertson, who, as much as any figure through his media network, Christian Broadcasting Network, helped to usher in re-usher in the kind of white Christian nationalism that has been front and center over the last several years. That if Pat Robertson is acknowledging the wrong of anti-Black police violence, then certainly there might be a space for a different kind of conversation. I don't know if either of the other panelists want to respond to this general question. Also in the context, I think, Bernard, of sort of racial justice organizing that you were speaking of across these spaces. Yeah.
Right. Well, I mean, in part, the tragedy of these police killings is so extensive and so great and reaches into so many different communities that I think inevitably it brings movements together. And so the tragic death of Adam Toledo in Chicago, 13-year-old young boy, is kind of, is tragically the way in which these movements in different sections of the movement against police violence can work together, do work together. That was a very different community that was affected in Chicago, in Little Village, and so that has tragically, I mean, the numbers are so overwhelming here. While the Chauvin trial has been going on, the drumbeat has continued. We're talking about 3 police fatal shootings a day. We knew this. I mean, since we've started to record this more, around 2015, basically, when the Washington Post and the Guardian started trying to keep statistics. I mean, we became aware of the, over 1,000 shooting deaths a year by the police, and that's what that means, is that the victims, it's a broad swath of the of mostly communities of color, but that then brings together lots of different protest movements and communities to work together, and not to view this as a kind of in any way a competition of trauma, but rather working together to try and address these wrongs.
Absolutely. Thank you, Bernard. Camilla, did you want to jump in here as well, or?
Yeah, I think the other thought I'd contribute to this is just the need to make it local or sort of bring it back home. And I think that's an important, piece of the conversation. This is all, I think, to Farah's point about it's, hyper attention, by the media on the Chauvin trial and the implications, but we know that this larger work and the importance of coalition building and building, solidarity across communities, both white identified and BIPOC communities, so essential to actually making meaningful and sustained changes, towards dismantling white supremacy. But that's work that's national and also like very local. And I think we all have a responsibility in really bringing this these discussions that are on topics that have the national attention, but bringing it down and really focusing it to that micro and that very local level.
Because that work is indeed being done at the local level across lines of difference. Absolutely. So I want to thank folks who are offering questions in the Q&A. I want to lift one up to the panel that speaks to bringing things home local in another context, back to where Vice Provost Mitchell brought us at the beginning of the conversation. And I want to acknowledge what might appear as bias in that this question comes from a student in the religion department. So thank you, Zara, for this wonderful question, and I'll just rehearse it here. How does one engage with the experience of living discrimination and violence within the space of universities, which it may seem remain oblivious to their own histories of violence, right? So in Zara's reading, Columbia writes itself out of its own history of racism. How do we engage critically with questions of responsibility and the experience of race within the space of university? I think Provost Mitchell has helped signal the ways in which Columbia is taking up this work. And I can think of other, sort of course offerings and projects that do this at the space in the university. I wonder, in your own, across the university in arts and science, at the law school, at school of social work, how you see yourself or have thoughts on ways in which members of the Columbia community can do this work within the context of the institution that we currently work at and live at and study at. In whatever order you want to jump in, that's fine.
Well, I would say that, I thank the student for that question. One thing about university communities is that we are made up of various units and collections and collectives, and that there are oftentimes, the very critique that we see embedded in that question is also being taken up in a number of different contexts at the university itself. And, whether it's in individual scholarship with people who are looking at Columbia's role, say, in creating, for instance, the Dunning School of History, right? Yep. Kind of apologists for slavery. And that same department creating a revision of how we looked at Reconstruction that called our attention to what was problematic there. That I would say the universities are places of contestation, and that you can genuinely find those arguments, those debates in various corners. There are conversations going on right now. I know Dennis is involved in them. I'm involved in them about processes for allowing our community to talk about who do we recognize? How do we recognize them? What do we memorialize? How do we memorialize it? And so I think the kind of pushing that I see in that question is one that we welcome from students, because there are always people trying to create venues for those conversations. Bernard and I have been involved in some of them as well through the Just Society. So I think that there are various venues where those debates and conversations are happening, and they need to happen more, and they need to be more inclusive and include larger parts of our community.
Absolutely.
This is something I'll just sort of jump in here. I don't, and Farah, that was so, it was so insightful. I think what I find myself reflecting, and in the School of Social Work, we've been doing a lot of thinking and talking about this as we really think about addressing issues of anti-Black racism in our curriculum and you know, anti-oppressive practices through the board. And I think what I find myself reflecting on is that this is a constant process that requires constant like pressure, you know, and so, which is not, I don't know if that's a hopeful message, but I think it's, I think it's messy. I think it's not linear. I think in some ways that, you know, one of the most helpful insights I heard recently in a training is how, you know, institutions are made up of people. And so, you know, people can change and there can be changes. I think the rate of change might look a bit different, but it does require this sense of constant pressure. And I do want to, and thank you, Yosef, for uplifting a student question that oftentimes that constant pressure comes from students as well, and can be used to effectively make changes and to have, you know, create spaces for contestation and challenge within the university, and that students really do play a critical role in that.
Yeah, I would echo that and just emphasize how much it is ultimately a question of each of our responsibility to challenge our own dark histories and the dark histories of institutions of which we are a part. And I think that Zehra, you're doing that right now, and that's critical. And we all need to be doing that and posing the difficult questions. We have a tendency at these institutions about truth, of not sufficiently challenging truth and authority. And I think that's our greatest task. And so I thank Zehra Mehdi for raising that and for challenging us to do that all the time.
Absolutely. And she is indeed also helping us do that within the local level of the department. So I'm glad to see she's here and bringing that conversation, as I know so many other students are doing. So a couple more questions are coming in. I'm also receiving confirmation that we will get through this panel before a verdict. The verdict is now, I'm being told, will be read between 4:30 and 5. I want to ask, I think I have time for one more round of questions, or one question that we might each offer a response. And I'll ask it in a particular way, but as always, I invite you all to go with whatever direction makes sense. And I'm very reluctant to I don't want to think of this question as wrapping up our conversation in a bow. And I think in some ways, so much of what's already been said in this, it goes in this direction. But I wonder, you know, even as we're girding ourselves up for the verdict between a competing set of impulses and feelings, I wonder where in the midst of all this, you all find, and maybe this is part of the practices of self-care, the sources of hope, right? I think Farah's example of Pat Robertson was for me a sort of, right, unanticipated, right? If that space is shifting, maybe there is some hopefulness there, but then also the history of Columbia's history department that goes from, right, offering an apologetic for slavery to documenting the institution's record. I think, right, there are any number of spaces that I find at the local level, at the, you know, familial level, for spaces and sources of hope that move our conversation forward. I wonder where for you, right, as folks who continue to do this work in the classroom and also in your lives, where you find that hope, or where might you point to other examples that might give everyone in the conversation today, in the days ahead, spaces to turn as resources in this regard.
Well, maybe I'll kick it off.
Go ahead, Bernard.
So that Farah and Carmela can be the last speakers and orient us in the right direction. So let me just tentatively say, I find hope in movements of protest and in people coming together to challenge authority and challenge truth. That's what I find hope. I do not find hope in the criminal legal ordeal, which was something that I was trying to kind of touch on at the beginning. I mean, the criminal legal ordeal is in a large sense responsible for the mess we're in and for the racial injustices in this country. I mean, W.E.B. Du Bois said it very clearly back in 1935 in Black Reconstruction in America, how, you know, the South and the North, I mean, how whites turned to the criminal process as a way to re-enslave freed Black men and women. It was chiefly through the criminal process, through convict leasing, through criminalization to disenfranchise, through plantation prisons, et cetera, that we were able in this country to reestablish the racial hierarchy that exists here. It was through the criminal devices, and so it's not by turning to the criminal legal process that I find hope. It's really in the mass and the movements that have been going on, since so long. Of course, civil rights movement, Black Panther movement, I mean, back in the 1950s and 60s, but the movement for Black lives that was triggered with Eric Garner and in Ferguson, et cetera, and that has been so strong and so powerful. And that's where I see hope, and that's where I find hope and comfort.
Thank you, Bernard.
I agree. And in the movements, in the communities, the ways that local communities respond, react, take care of each other, the kind of ethic of care that governs communities and that govern movements. And in the history of movements, I recently wrote a chapter that includes a story of the multiracial group of abolitionists in Philadelphia, the city of my birth, and how bold they were and imaginative and courageous. And so that that these movements don't emerge without a history. And that so often we have to document the history of the oppression and the violence, but there's always been movements in response to those things. And so I would agree. And I also have to say, having taught my last class for the semester this year, is that I find hope in my students. You know, I who can imagine things that in my old cynical self just can't even imagine. You know, that they not only can imagine them, they can live in ways that I could not have even thought possible. And so I find hope there.
Thank you, Farah. Carmela.
Yeah, thank you both for those reflections. I really agree, and those resonate with me. Yosef, with this question, I found myself thinking about purpose more so than hope. And, you know, how could, because it feels like purpose is something we have more direct control over than hope. And so how could we use this opportunity to renew our sense of purpose in, you know, racial justice work? That's a helpful frame for me, as is, I found myself reflecting on purpose, but Farah's point about students, and I think going back to that earlier point about constant pressure and being agents for change and seeing, envisioning possibilities that I think is harder, I think, particularly when we're entrenched within these institutions. So I have to say I do find hope in thinking about the, you know, current generation of students and scholars. But this piece about purpose, we can control, right? We can control what we find purpose in. We can't control what the outcome of a trial or other such processes may be.
Absolutely. I appreciate that reframing of the question. In fact, as you all were talking, I was sort of thinking about initially with Bernard's comment on the movement for Black lives. I was, you know, flashing back across now, right, sustained, prominent, organized efforts that, right, we think of as this movement, going back to Eric Garner, Michael Brown, and others, up to the present day. I think of entering into the Intro to African American Studies class in the immediate aftermath of that first summer of 2014, and the kind of purposefulness that the students were bringing, even as we not unoften in that class found ourselves looking at each other, almost short on words, the kind of purposefulness they were bringing to their questions and to their desire and to their study towards the end of trying to reimagine and imagine a new world. So I think that is a fitting way to reframe as we move from here out from this conversation with purposefulness in mind for our studying, for our organizing, for our activism, for the work we want to do in building a different kind of world. I want to hand it over back to University Life. I believe Associate Vice President Ishel Roselle will be giving us some final remarks, but I want to, of course, thank the Office of University Life and the Office of the Vice Provost for Faculty Advancement, Dennis Mitchell, for bringing us together for this conversation. Thank these panelists for helping to lead us forward in such powerful and clear ways. And thank you, Ishel, for bringing us home.
And thank you, Yosef, for moderating.
Thank you, Yosef. I am Ishel Rosal with the Office of University Life, one of the sponsoring offices for this event. I want to thank today's panelists, Carmela Alcantara, Farah Jasmine Griffin, and Bernard Harcourt for being part of today's conversation. I especially want to thank Yosef Saret for moderating and Dennis Mitchell and the Office of the Vice Provost for Faculty Advancement for co-sponsoring. The United States is a country marked by change and dynamism. However, we continually fight against white supremacy, anti-Black racism, hate, and violence. We find ourselves as a nation and the community once again on the precipice of change. The trial will end. The jurors are currently deliberating, though I hear soon to share a verdict, and we will learn how they rule in this case shortly. This is a historic moment we are witnessing, rife with complications and tensions, some of which we've just spoken about. The work of racial justice and authentic inclusion is a life's work. It's challenging work, and it can also be deeply uncomfortable. But it is on all of us to be leaders and active participants working together. Please know that we at University Life are committed to continuing both conversations and action steps to keep our community moving in the direction of anti-racism and inclusion. I want to thank everyone for joining today. Take care.